Hi everyone, my name is Balázs Jarábik, founder of Minority Report, a political risk consultancy in Central Europe. We're talking about how Ukraine relationship with the neighbors is developing, particularly with Hungary, the bilateral breakthrough, but also going deeper into Ukraine regional posture, which is going to be increasingly on Fortress Ukraine and its defense capabilities.
Welcome to the Visegrad Insight podcast.
We bring you global experts on the future of democracy, security, and economy.
The leading voices from Central Europe and on Central Europe.
Hosted by editors of Visegrad Insight.
Powered by Respublika Foundation from Warsaw, Poland.
Balázs, so good to have you on the podcast. We're talking on the 6th of June 2026 in Cres in Croatia, the sidelines of the Europe's Future initiative. We're fellows at a fantastic, with a fantastic group of other people, but part of our conversations here and also between us for a long time is about the nature of relations between Ukraine and Hungary. It seems like there is a breakthrough, or we hear about a breakthrough after Hungarian elections, and you've been looking very closely into what the breakthrough really is about. We know that Hungarians are unlocking some of the doors that have been locked by Orbán for Ukraine pathway towards the EU, but even the support, the continuous support of Ukraine. But what is the price that Magyar was able to, and Anita Orbán as a foreign minister, able to extract from Ukrainians for making Ukrainian pathway more open? What do we know?
So thank you for hosting me and having me. I think it's my first time, so I appreciate the invite, and I'm really happy to be with you here. Not mentioning Cres, which is a fantastic place. So yes, indeed, let me kind of divide your question into two parts. One is, let's talk about the breakthrough, and then what were the conditions as well as the factors which make that breakthrough happen. It's a breakthrough, although I would call it tactical breakthrough for a good reason. It's a breakthrough definitely for the Hungarians, because according to the information which I have access to, and I talk to both sides, both the Ukrainian and the Hungarian delegations, they have been technical working group level consultations between the two sides for weeks. So it's not coming out of the blue. And accordingly, around about 80-90%, the Ukrainian delegation agreed with Hungary's original 11 points, which was the Orbán government handed last January to Kyiv as their conditions if Ukraine should meet to uplift the veto which Budapest at that time put on Ukraine-EU integration process. So what really worked is the veto. After the change, and I must say that the Hungarian electoral campaign was a large extent about Ukraine because of the previous government. It was a previous government campaign. And one of the reasons I believe is why Fidesz lost the elections is because it put Ukraine first instead of putting the country's conditions and solutions and vision for the Hungarians first. But it kind of put the two-country relationship into an absolute freezer. Or even actually, it's not just the two countries' relationship was frozen. It has become into a dangerous conflict point, I would even argue. It was very much heightened. There was not just tensions, but an open conflict between the two countries. And it looked like the Hungarian government would even welcome some kind of conflict between the two countries simply because that could driven home the point of Ukraine danger for the Hungarian electorate. That didn't happen, thanks God, and it was very clear that from this viewpoint, we can just go up.
So just let's go back a little bit in the recent history to enumerate these points where Hungarian government claimed there was illegal Ukrainian operation in Hungary, all of that is being unwinded and discovered, among others, that Viktor Orban personally ordered a raid on the banking convoy, on the bank convoy, and seized the money and basically used the counter-terrorist units to capture the people who were working for the Ukrainian bank. There was on the day of elections, there was allegedly Ukrainian subversion on the Serbian territory, which then was debunked by the Serbian military on the same day later on, probably also by Orban himself, because he was quite cheerfully, knowing about this incident, cheerfully enjoying some opening of a monument on Mount Geller or somewhere there in Budapest. There were allegations about Ukrainian special services meddling in the demonstrations and protests. I think there was an attempt to delegitimize Peter Magyar campaign as being sponsored by Ukraine special forces. Anything that I'm missing of the big time?
Oh, you're missing a lot. But so, you know, the Zelenskyy posters in the election campaign.
Right.
But I also must say, and I think this is kind of an important thing for the context, is that so all these, the Hungarian government, the previous Hungarian government was using, Orbán government was using Ukraine not out of the blue. It was part of their tactic vis-a-vis the European Commission to unfreeze their money, the EU funds, which had been frozen, around 20 billion still, due to rule of law procedures, right? So the Orbán government tactic was using Ukraine, which has become, even before the war, which has become increasingly important for the Commission to kind of push back against this. So that's one of the reasons why Ukraine was so high in the campaign, not the Hungarian-Ukrainian bilateral relations. These has been worsening ever since 2015, when the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian parliament passed the education and then the language first and then the educational laws, which according to the Hungarians are reduced the rights of the Hungarian minority. So this is where the bilateral dimension comes in. And there is a European dimension where the Hungary and the Orbán government was using Ukraine increasingly and the veto over Ukraine-related issues when it comes to the European Peace Fund, which is reimbursing essentially member states' weapons shipments to Ukraine, which was just also uplifted this week, if I'm not mistaken, as well as, stopping the EU accession process or vetoing the EU accession, certain stages of the EU accession process for Ukraine itself. But it was more connected to, so these two tracks I would even separate, right? The bilateral, which is about a loss of minority rights for the Hungarians, and this is very important for them, right, for Budapest, and it stays. And then the European track, which let's use Ukraine as an increasingly a very important topic for the Commission to blackmail them. And it's also like connected to Orbán and European ambition, which I believe was one of the reasons why they lost the Hungarian elections, because for the Hungarians were too much that, essentially the Orbán government asked for permission to continue their European track, but neglecting the Hungarian one. So now let's go back. So now we're coming back to this, and these are the two dimensions which are kind of playing an important role here. It's a tactical breakthrough because the Hungarians agreed, as I mentioned, the Ukrainians agreed around 80-90% to accommodate the Hungarian requests. This was the 11 points. They agreed on certain issues, particularly related to education as well as language rights. I think the only thing which in the end the Hungarian dropped is a permanent a parliamentary representation for their minority, which would require constitutional changes in Ukraine, and it's not. So why I'm calling it a tactical breakthrough, because it is based on a certain concrete document, right? And it's connected to Hungary uplifting the veto for the upcoming council meeting, where the clusters negotiations can be open both for Ukraine and Moldova, therefore, right? This was the important decision which Hungary was blocking. It is very important for the Commission, for Ukraine. So it's a kind of a win-win. The Ukrainians give concessions to the Hungarians on the bilateral track on the minority rights, and Hungary uplift the veto, which is very important for both the Commission and Ukraine to move the EU integration forward. Why it's tactical, just very quickly finishing it, is because the probe of the pudding will be the implementation or the eating. This requires the Ukrainian parliament to pass changes in the legislation. This requires time And I think it's yet to see, and it's a very sensitive ethno-political issues, which goes into the foundation of the modern Ukrainian state, the post-Maidan Ukrainian state, and therefore I would be very cautious to see whether it's maybe possible to implement or not.
Hi, if you're enjoying this episode, why not subscribe to Visegrad Insight? This gives you access to all our latest content online, as well as to our live and online events. You can use our special promo code for Visegrad Insight podcast listeners to get 35% off. Just go to visegradinsight.eu, choose a yearly subscription, and apply code Visegrad35. And now, back to the podcast.
Yeah, there are now at least 2 or 3 tracks open, and let's try to summarize that. I want to start by asking the question on how important this particular issue of Hungarian minority in Ukraine is, because I think the listeners might deserve to know actually what size and specificity of the situation we're talking about in the context of not the only ethnic minority in Ukraine. And we have already resolved the issue of the Polish minority in Ukraine, impacted originally by the same legislation that you mentioned. This issue bilaterally has been resolved earlier on by the previous PIS government between Poland and Ukraine. So this is a very focused discussion on this issue, which constitutes a larger European constellation, how you basically integrate Europe and how the European project needs to move forward in it by recognizing minority rights and this complexity of ethnicities and nationalities across the board. And there is the second question that seems, it is about European integration process for Ukraine, and it is very much a European game in parallel to what the Commission ambition is, but what other member states' ambitions are towards Ukraine. And we're talking about this question right in the context of Polish hosted Ukraine Recovery Conference that overlaps, interestingly, with the third aspect that I think you also touch upon, which is the Ukrainian agenda, national politics, including a certain national politics of memory, politics of history, identity questions, how the current cultural policy, but also the political culture of Ukraine has been shaped over the recent years, and that creates tensions not just on the Hungarian Ukrainian dimension, but very recently, as we are recording this podcast, on the Polish-Ukrainian dimension as well. So let's do this exactly one by one. First, let's talk about the local specificity here. How important and where does it come from, the Hungarian minority issue in Ukraine?
So the Hungarian minority issue comes broadly, very broadly, comes from Hungary losing 2 world wars and then giving up any territorial claims toward the neighbors. But adopting protection of minority rights as one of the key pillars of its foreign policy. So we're really talking about a 70, 80 years of foreign policy tradition of Hungary. This is important. I don't want to use the word sacred, but essentially was a key importance for every government after the regime change, and even before regime change, it was a key pillar for the communist Hungary leadership. So there is nothing really new. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, it's actually very specific. In 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, there was about 300,000 Hungarians in Zakarpattia, which was about, at the time, maybe even over 10% of the population, right? Now in Zakarpattia, well, it's very hard. First of all, it's very hard to say. We don't even know how many people live in Ukraine, right? Because the last census was in 2001. So, but I assume that currently in Zakarpattia, it's around 2.53 million overall population. And the current level of Hungarian population is, in a very optimistic number, is 120,000. The Hungarians usually signing 150,000. I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually the actual number since the war and the outflow of people, including Hungarians who had, at the very beginning of the war, they had very easy with the Hungarian passport. You could leave the country much easier than with the Ukrainian passport, particularly for males. So I would even not surprising if there would be like 70, 80,000 Hungarians left. Now the Hungarian government doesn't going to give up. So it's kind of, and this is I think how Kyiv is seeing this situation as well. The numbers are so insignificant that even if we say that 2.5 million Ukrainians or overall population in Zakarpattia, we are not even talking about what, even it's let's say 100,000, we're not even talking about 4% of the population. So the numbers are really now Beregovo, 25,000 town and 40-50 villages around. You know, if I'm gonna be not nice, I would be characterizing this. So it's not really, and neither Hungary nor the Hungarian minority, in my view, is a threat to Ukrainian. Hungary has no territorial, obviously, claims or anything, but this is very important for them. And indeed, there is a very easily documented loss of minority rights. You know, and not only for the Hungarians, so it's not targeted. I always call this process as a collateral damage. The de-Russification, or exactly as you're saying, the Ukrainian ethno-national state, the post-Maidan, you know, the Western Ukrainian, the Galician kind of understanding of the nation and nation building, and that's what is clashing with the protection of the right of minorities from the Hungarian viewpoint, as well as memory politics when it comes to Poland. But there are also clashes in between Slovaks and Ukrainians for various other reasons. So Ukraine, because of these trajectory and trends, essentially have very strong conflicts with all of its neighbors, including Romania. But the Romanian tactic is very different to the Hungarians. The Romanians are not talking about it, but they do actually believe and assess the situation exactly as the Hungarians. Now, compared to the Hungarians, there are much higher number of Romanians left in Ukraine. There are 250,000 Romanians, ethnic Romanians, and 250,000 Moldovans, which they still considering themselves Moldovans, but they both speaking Romanian. So the actual Romanian-speaking population is around 700,000 people, which is very significant in Bukovina and around southern Odessa region. So that's one thing. The second, which I want to emphasize, that for the Hungarians, the Zakarpattia connection is very strong when it comes to how they're being informed and how they're being shaped by how they view Ukraine. Why? Because the Zakarpattia Hungarians, the share of the Zakarpattia Hungarians in the media, in foreign policy, in diplomacy, in actual Hungarian politics are very significant. So they are essentially working as a filter for the Hungarian society. Essentially, almost all of the journalists who are writing about Ukraine are from Zakarpattia origin. Right. So, and they do this, and the Zakarpattia Hungarians, they do feel similarly, not the same, but similarly as the Ukrainians feel about the Russians, right? Because of the loss of their minority rights, they feel being abused by the post-Maidan Ukrainian governments. And this is very much reflecting on how the Hungarian society as well as Hungarian politics views Ukraine. This is not and this is often being translated as a pro-Russian position, right? Hungary is in a very different situation because the Hungarians are actually remaining quite anti-Russian as well, but they do not like what is happening in Ukraine because of their filter is Zakarpattia.
Well, I believe this can go on with explanation, but I think we get a more clear picture on why it matters and how the peculiarities of the Hungarian history and diplomacy, as you described, are the foundations of it, intersect with the political sociology of what's going on and how the public opinion is being formed, and how important it is for any politician in Hungary to relate to that today. Now, on the question of European policy and the ambitions, well, you said these were in a way this was blackmail or leverage on the of Hungarian governments to have impact on European ambitions, European Commission ambitions particularly, but some member states also ambitions towards Ukraine, and Orbán has played that card. Magyar is now giving out all these cards. He's gonna lean in on the integration of Ukraine. How would you describe the position of Budapest? Still, I wouldn't say incoming government, the newly formed government, but still a government in formation as we speak, towards the future ambition of Ukraine in the EU. Is it going to be basically no roadblocks ahead and difficult issues?
So essentially what the Magyar government does is utilizing the Orbán government veto, because when Magyar became prime minister, he essentially immediately said that this is an important issue and the veto stays. So Hungary didn't give up the veto.
Okay, so the question is...
Hungary gave up the veto only after there is a substantial agreement with the Ukrainians. So essentially they're utilizing the Orbán government veto to bring something home, right? And this results really is going to be, from the Hungarian viewpoint, is a tactical breakthrough. Tactical because of the implementation is still lagging. And they would... The other side of the story is that Magyar and von der Leyen, so the Commission and Budapest relationship is also changing. The new government doesn't have European ambition, just as the previous Orbán government did.
European in the sense of leading the pack or changing the direction.
Yes, they're not fighting for European level leadership, right? They want to fix the relationship between the Commission and Budapest. It was a very different ambition from the Orbán government. And that means bringing the EU funds home, which has become a significant factor for the decline of the Hungarian economy and the decline of Fidesz popularity. These are the clear correlation between the two. And so uplifting the veto, fixing relationship, bringing EU funds home is all in one package. It's meaning that we have to put something on the table for the Hungarians, for this society which actually continuously sees this issue as important. So they couldn't betray the Zakarpattia Hungarians as well as the Hungarian society with this. And with this tactical breakthrough, Magyar is actually scoring an important political victory at home as well. Meanwhile, confirming that the expectations from the European level and the European mainstream political level that we're not going to be continuing the Orbán style of bad boy politics.
But that is also giving up a number of, bilateral negotiations with Ukraine on some sectoral...
The Hungarians calculated that I think that there is 62 more points where they can block and veto, and
in the current context
of the EU integration. So I think the consideration is that this is very good enough. We have something on paper, right? We'll monitor the implementation and working with the Ukrainian side very closely in a different pragmatic manner. So implementation matters, and if necessary, then we can go back to the veto, right? But this is very good enough. And I talked to a few of my friends in Budapest, like how they see the actual agreement, which we have been the information is just getting publicized or leaked. They're all very positive, and they said this is a big test for the Magyar government from a patriotic, more the Fidesz, so the right or the right-wing political society as well. So this is an important political victory for Magyar, and everybody considered this agreement as essentially an important tactical victory or breakthrough from the Hungarian view.
Hello again! If you're enjoying this episode, make sure to give us a rating. It really helps boost our platform and invite more guests for you, our listeners.
That opens, in fact, Hungarian positions towards Ukraine, but as you say, seeing it now as an element of the game Europe plays, and all member states in Europe plays with Ukraine, seeing there is some element of negotiation that is not going to be so destructive negotiations. I mean, the positional...
Yes, absolutely. Importantly, though, and this is what the Magyar government immediately said, that the number of previous Hungarian position is not changing. There is no weapon sales. There is no military assistance, right? And the government, as they're not want to veto the European integration of Ukraine, they're not for rapid integration. Magyar, essentially, after the election, was the first European head of state by that time, elected at least, who openly said that no, we are not we are not for rapid integration. He said it first before Merz and Macron. We are actually for the long merit-based process. And this is where the Hungarian possibility of monitoring and coming back to veto, if it's necessary, comes in. They don't want to heighten the tensions, the understanding, and they, again, be much more pragmatic when it comes to the Ukrainians. But again, the Ukrainians put down concessions, which the Hungarians perhaps didn't even expect. So this is really looking good from the viewpoint of minority rights and minority protection.
And again, this is not so different from other countries in Central Eastern Europe who not only rejected the proposal of Merz of associated membership, which was kind of a half-baked proposal of a new model of integration, essentially, that, for instance, Poland doesn't look as very valuable because it doesn't incentivize Ukraine to continue the reforms and changes that Poland, in its own spectrum, sees as fundamental, like corruption, but also some elements related to logistics or agriculture sectors that are of critical importance from the vital interests of the Polish economies, and then sensitivities at home politically because of the agricultural, the population engaged in agriculture or having sentiments about it. But that opens again the third chapter of where is Ukraine in all of this, because we spoke about the Hungarian game in a way. I can talk about the Polish game, but what is really interesting is what Ukrainian game is all about here with the mix of memory of politics and the hard interest. I'm asking this question to you, Balázs, because obviously Ukrainians are happy to take some pragmatic steps. They recognize the other position. They are willing to talk about these things. And at the same time, we are living in the over 2-week period that is going to intensify even the conflict, the Polish-Hungarian, Polish-Ukrainian conflict on the politics of memory and the recognition of the 140 special operations regiment with the name of the heroes of UPA. That Zelenskyy decided to give, maybe even, we don't know, or maybe you know whose exact idea it was, but it created a fault line in the Polish-Hungarian relations, and we're going to see how it unfolds. But it speaks, I just want to ask you the question of where does it come from the Ukrainian perspective?
This is a general trend from the post-Maidan period, which was also corresponding with the Russia-Ukrainian war, right? So we see the emergence of a much more ethno-nationalistic Ukrainian state, which goes back to certain traditions which were connected to Western Ukraine. And this has been the case from 2014, 2015, the annexation of Crimea, the Donbas conflict, and now the full-scale war with Ukraine has accelerating rapidly this. What is also accelerating this trend is the depopulation of Ukraine, a westward shift. Ukraine is essentially being pushed by the war with Russia toward westward. People have been flooding the borders, Slovakia, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary. They all have now substantial Ukrainian minorities. These are not minorities, these are refugees. But at the same time, it's very clear that a lot of them are not going to go back. Only those are going to go back who are kind of fine with living in a fortress Ukraine. And this has been the Zelenskyy's concept. So where this mythology around UPA and all this is one of the backbone, and as well the de-Russification, and a language fate, as Poroshenko's famous slogan was, right? I mean, these are the important elements of it, and Zelenskyy has adopted simply because that's going to be this is the mainstream Ukrainian politics. There's no other at this stage. Now, this is corresponding with another important factor, and that's Ukrainian defense posture. And Ukraine, and this is going to be kind of in conflict to the extent with the EU integration, because we need Poland and everyone else need Ukraine to be a fortress, or I don't want to call it a buffer zone because it's much more than a buffer zone now. It's a very active war between Russia and Ukraine with our support on the Ukrainian side openly.
Ukraine is keeping Russia on a distance from us.
And we are absolutely interested in, even Orbán said it, we are not interested in Russia at our border. We're interested in the sovereign Ukraine at our border. We're capable to do that. So this defense, or the defense integration, is going to be accelerated, but I think the EU integration is going to be kind of slowing down. It has become much more difficult, and not only because of the technicalities, but simply the Ukraine as such, in the current Ukraine, is not structurally compatible with the rest of the EU. And can even give you one sector, agriculture. How are we going to integrate Ukrainian agriculture into the current EU? It's not possible. There is ample internal changes.
But both sides would need to change fundamentally on the policy.
Fundamentally, and exactly, Wojciech, the actual issue is fundamentally, and these fundamental changes requires a lot of time. What is going to be accelerated is the defense integration, and this is where Ukraine has the cards, and this is what Ukraine is going to be using more and more. That's what they do with Belarus, and that's what they do already with Moldova, Transnistria, for example, right? When they openly saying we can solve it militarily with no problem. The Moldovan government is not interested in, but it's a separate question, is how
the frozen conflict there with the Russian forces.
Conflict, exactly. So Ukraine is going to use where it's strongest, and that's the military defense domain. And since it's very kind of getting clear that they're capable to hold the Russians at bay, right? And the war is not going to be ending with Ukraine army and utter collapse, then this is going to be a major card in European-Ukraine relationship. This is going to be number one, and this is what Ukraine is going to use to the extent possible vis-a-vis its neighbors as well.
So this is what we are seeing probably, and it's a good explainer in my opinion, because it's there is a military rationale for giving this politics of memory title, aggravating situation with Poland to the extent nobody really can believe in, because you would need to dive into the Polish context to understand how the sense of memory of victims that were never honored properly enough, and the investigation is ongoing, is putting everybody on all sides of the spectrum in Poland against the decision of Zelenskyy. But he has also domestic logic, so military driven for nation building. But also it seems that what you say is a tactics vis-a-vis neighbors and the European Union, signaling this is how we're gonna do our foreign policy.
It's not about Zelenskyy. I think Poland should get ready that this is not Zelenskyy, this is the new Ukraine, which we're going to see. Increasing methodology around these figures, again, it's the Western Ukrainization of Ukraine as Ukraine is being shifted westward by the Russians.
And again, this is very important again for the listeners to understand. UPA as a generally units and organization from the Second World War that legitimately fought, the Soviets and the occupation in a partisan way in the western part of Ukraine specifically, also are attributed the massacre on the ethnic cleansing, essentially, of the Poles.
The Poles, this is well documented. Yes, absolutely. So, but so this is going to be important, and all these issues are going to be only increasing. And I think it's a fault to say this is Zelenskyy. Somebody convinced him. Budanov convinced Zelenskyy. And no, this is essentially now becoming the funding factor in Ukrainian ethnopolitics, and it's the only or the most important mainstream currently in Ukraine when it comes to politics.
Balázs, thank you so much. We'll continue on this theme.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all from this week's episode of the Visegrad Insight podcast, bringing you the leading voices from Central Europe and on Central Europe.
Make sure to subscribe, and we'll be in touch next week.